If it's Tuesday, Republican leaders and 2024 rivals rally around the former president and ramp up their attacks on Manhattan prosecutors ahead of an expected historic criminal indictment. Plus, America's top adversaries hold formal talks in Moscow as Russia and China agree to strengthen their economic ties amid growing tensions with the U.S. And the nation's second largest school district shut down as tens of thousands of school workers strike in Los Angeles after last-ditch efforts to avert a three-day walkout failed. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington. Republican leaders escalating attacks on Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg today, reaffirming former President Trump's enduring hold on his party, even as he is poised to become the first former president ever indicted. Republican leaders are focusing their fire on the Manhattan DA, whose office could bring charges in the coming days tied to hush money payments Mr. Trump made to adult film star Stormy Daniels. This morning, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy defended former President Trump, criticized the press for asking him about the case, and called any prosecution politically motivated.
We live in America and it should be equal justice. This was personal money. This wasn't trying to hide. This was 7 years ago, statute of limitation. And I think in your heart of hearts, you know, too, that you think this is just political. So it's not here that we're coming to defend President Trump. What we're coming to defend is equal justice in America. What we see before us is a political game being played by a local. Look, just as this isn't New York City. This is just the Manhattan. This is just a borough DA.
Now, McCarthy's comments come a day after the Republican chairs of the House Judiciary and Oversight Committees called on Alvin Bragg to testify. House Republican Conference Chair Elise Stefanik told reporters she briefed the former president on her party's efforts to essentially investigate the investigators.
I really talked about our efforts on the Judiciary Committee, on the Oversight Committee. We also talked a lot about how what I've heard from his supporters in my district and across the country is he's never been in a stronger position in terms of rallying that support.
So you don't feel any slippage from your...
No, I think you're going to see the opposite. I think you'll see his poll numbers go up.
Republican Senator Rand Paul took things a step further, calling for Bragg to be put in jail. The reaction from the former president and his allies is a familiar page from a playbook they have deployed so many times before. That means unleashing personal attacks on social media and rallying supporters to protest. It means deflecting, distracting, and trying to discredit any institution or investigation they see as posing a threat. It's a strategy we've seen used in response to the Mueller investigation, two impeachment probes and trials, various investigations into the Trump Organization, the Justice Department search of Mar-a-Lago, and many more. It is a playbook that has worked often. But none of those investigations we just mentioned came this close to an actual criminal indictment against Mr. Trump, which begs the question, is this time different or not? Vaughn Hilliard is covering all things Trump in West Palm Beach, Florida. Joining me now is Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill, and also with us is Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official. He's also an NBC News contributor. Thanks to all of you for being here. Vaughn, I have to start with you. Look, despite what Trump has posted over the weekend, no indictment today. He's keeping his posting up, though, at a pretty high pace here over the last 24 hours. So take us inside Trump world. Vaughn, what are you hearing? What is the strategy going to be moving forward?
Right. It was Donald Trump himself on Saturday who speculated that he was going to be arrested on Tuesday. Of course, when he made that statement, no charges had been filed against him. And to the best of our knowledge, that is still the reality here on this Tuesday afternoon. There's been about 4 or 5 dozen folks who have come out to show their support for him just outside of his Mar-a-Lago private club here on this Tuesday. But for Donald Trump and the Trump campaign, they're seeing themselves about 30 percentage points up in polling here. They feel good about where they are politically. Of course, when you're talking about a potential indictment, as one ally of his tells me, he does not want to get arrested. This is not in his playbook. It was just earlier today in a Truth social media post in which he said that DA Bragg should not prosecute him. This is still a man that would much prefer not to have images of him in New York City here. And that is why his legal defense team requested that Robert Costello go before that grand jury, is sort of a last gasp a chance to potentially get into the minds of the jurors that Michael Cohen is the key witness in all of this, was to be questioned. Of course, we still don't know, because this is a secret grand jury process, the extent to which they have other corroborating witnesses or evidence to back up Michael Cohen. But this is a Trump operation here that would much prefer to not have him be indicted, Kristen.
You know, Vaughn, it's interesting. You actually dug back into the files of Stormy Daniels, that 2016 payment that was made. Just remind our viewers of why this was so significant and what you found when you went looking back into those files, back in the history books, if you will.
Right. This is now spanned, we're talking about 7 years here. We're talking about past statements of before the 2016 presidential election that are at the heart of this potential criminal proceeding here. Michael Cohen now says that he had explicit conversations with Donald Trump before the 2016 election to transfer $130,000 to Stormy Daniels prior to the presidential election. Donald Trump has consistently denied ever having that conversation and ever being aware of this entity that Michael Cohen set up to transfer the funds. Now, of course, this hits again at the questions of what evidence or corroborating witnesses back up Michael Cohen's claim, because federal prosecutors, when Michael Cohen pled guilty in 2018, they wrote in their sentencing memo that Michael Cohen was directed to make those payments at the behest of individual one, Donald Trump. But because that never went to trial, Kristen, the public never got to see the actual evidence or the other testimony of other potential witnesses that led prosecutors to make that statement. But now this is where it comes down to whether the grand jury feels like they have the potential evidence to bring charges against Donald Trump if Michael Cohen's version of events are accurate.
Vaughn Hilliard, great reporting, standing there behind Trump supporters with waving Trump flags. Thank you for that great reporting. Ryan Nobles, let me turn to you and what we are hearing from Republicans, this sort of remarkable attacking DA Alvin Bragg, but also trying to keep a distance from the accusations against former President Trump. Save Speaker McCarthy, who walked up to the line a little bit of defending what happened.
Yeah, what you see here, Kristen, is coordinated talking points amongst the Republicans here on Capitol Hill, particularly those Republicans in the House Republican Conference. They're describing this as a political witch hunt. They're attacking the district attorney in Manhattan, calling him someone that is funded by George Soros, who is, of course, a Democratic boogeyman for many Republicans. And they're essentially trying to set the stage that any sort of indictment that could come down will not be based on the merits of the evidence, but instead will just be based in a political calculation made by a hardened Democrat who just wants to see Donald Trump damaged by this politically. And what is interesting is that that has been the consistent theme across all the Republicans that we've talked to up until this point. And you're right, they don't want to talk about the merits of the case at all. They don't want to get into the fact that this was a hush money payment to a porn star, allegedly part of an affair that Donald Trump was involved in. They are way more focused on the fact that it's a partisan district attorney in their mind who is looking to cast a political vendetta against the person who they view as the strongest candidate for president in 2024. That's the line they're towing right now. Whether or not that will be able to continue to go forward if and when the indictment is handed down is still something we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, we absolutely are, Ryan. And you know, it's such an interesting week because here you have Republicans gathered in Orlando for this conference where presumably they want to be focused on their agenda over these next 2 years, particularly now that they have control of the House. And yet here we are again, a moment where the focus has been shifted to former President Trump. We saw this in the closing days of the midterms as well. Talking to your sources, is there a frustration about that, Ryan?
I don't need to talk to sources to tell you about it, Kristen, because they're openly saying how annoyed they are with this. You know, Kevin McCarthy said it repeatedly during the conference in Orlando that, you know, they, behind closed doors, are not making Donald Trump the focus of their conversation, that they are, in fact, having, you know, substantive conversations about the agenda that they want to push forward that has to do with energy independence, that has to do with reducing crime, that has to do with a number of other things that don't involve Donald Trump, at least not at this point. I will say, when you talk about sources, I did run into a former United States senator who was a Republican who told me that they are very glad that they are not here having to answer questions about Donald Trump anymore. But yeah, that's not what they want to be talking about. But unfortunately, you know, the base of this party is still inexorably linked to Donald Trump. He is still the kind of the heartbeat and the driving force of this Republican conference. And because many of these Republicans that are elected right now on Capitol Hill are so kind of running on the agenda that he's established, it's hard for them to quit Donald Trump. And they're in a position where they're forced to answer questions about him, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, very well stated. Ryan Nobles, thank you so much for all your great reporting from Capitol Hill. Chuck Rosenberg, thank you for being here on an important day while we are bracing for what could be this potential indictment against the former president. Can you put into context what happened yesterday? You have Robert Costello, an attorney for Mr. Trump, appearing before the grand jury based on our reporting, essentially saying that Michael Cohen is a liar, cannot be trusted at his word. You heard Vaughn there say this was a little bit of a Hail Mary. From a legal perspective, was that what it was, or could there be a real impact here? Could it slow down the process?
Yeah, I find that unlikely, Kristen. So New York State has a quirky law, something we don't have in the federal system, that permits a defendant, or in this case, a subject of a grand jury investigation, to ask that the grand jury hear from one of their witnesses, somebody who will tell the grand jury why he ought not be charged, or in this case, why the grand jury ought not credit one of the government's witnesses. So it's a little bit of a quirky procedure. Remember, though, grand juries only need to find probable cause, a relatively low standard. By the way, it comes from the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution in order to issue an indictment. So, yes, it's a bit of a Hail Mary. I would be surprised if it worked. I imagine that the prosecutors have put in lots of evidence far in excess of the probable cause standard that they need to meet in order for the grand jury to return what we call a true bill, a valid indictment.
And just thinking about Michael Cohen as a witness, you have said before, witnesses do not have to be priests and nuns. What is the relevance or significance of a Michael Cohen being interviewed by a grand jury and playing a role in that process?
Yeah, Kristen, look, I wish when I was a federal prosecutor that all of my witnesses were nuns and librarians. That would have made it easy. But that's not how crime works. Yeah. And so it's not unusual at a criminal trial to have a criminal testify about the crime. So when you have that, when you have an inside criminal source or someone with criminal knowledge or culpability, you wouldn't predicate a case entirely on that person. That would be risky. But you would try and have that person corroborated by documents and other witnesses. So this case won't rise or fall solely on the testimony of Michael Cohen. When he gets on the stand, he'll be an important witness, if he does get on the stand. And if he does get on the stand, he'll be cross-examined, I imagine, vigorously. But a prosecutor would be wise in any case like this, and there are many around the country every day in state and federal court where criminals are now testifying for the government against their co-conspirators. A prosecutor would be wise to corroborate it in any way that she can.
And just thinking about this case, big picture, Chuck, obviously there are a number of investigations swirling around the former president. There's the investigation in Georgia into attempts to overturn the election results there. There's the investigation by the Attorney General into January 6th. You have Republicans pointing out about this New York case that the SDNY didn't take it up. They say that proves this is not a serious case. I, of course, don't want you to weigh in on the politics of this, but from a legal perspective, when you take the swirl of cases around the former president, how serious is this New York case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's assume the public reporting is correct. This appears to be the least serious case of the cases we know about. That doesn't mean it's not an important case or a valid case, or it doesn't mean it ought not be brought. When I was a prosecutor, I thought of cases really sort of in two dimensions. Do we have compelling evidence, evidence that's admissible and relevant and compelling, and that will withstand appeal? Do we have good evidence? And do we have a serious offense? So you might have compelling evidence here, meaning it's not a weak case, Kristen, but compared to efforts to overthrow the 2020 election or submit fake electors or to instigate a riot or an insubordination or an insurrection at the Capitol, this is less serious than that. Again, valid? Let's wait and see the charges. Important? Sure. As important as some of these other investigations? Probably not. But that doesn't mean it's not a valid case.
And Chuck, just very quickly before I let you go, this New York case carries risk for the prosecutors as well, doesn't it?
Oh, sure. I mean, anytime you bring a case in court, you have to have evidence sufficient to win it before a jury and sustain it on appeal. And so prosecutors are going to be careful in what they charge and how they charge it. And by the way, with all the criticism being aimed at Mr. Bragg in this case, if Mr. Trump's attorneys have a concern about the way it's charged or some procedural defect, the way you make that claim, the way you fight that fight is in court with a motion in front of a judge, not on Capitol Hill, not on television, right, and not by hunking your horns outside of the courthouse. If you have a problem, if you have a concern, file a motion in court and let a judge hear it.
All right, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you so much for joining us. I know we're going to be turning to you a lot over the next few weeks. Really appreciate it. And before that, thanks to Vaughn and Ryan Nobles. Coming up, power, politics, and prosecutions, the latest reaction from Trump's potential 2024 rivals as the former president faces a looming indictment. The panel's next. Plus, President Putin hosts what he calls his dear friend, Xi Jinping, for a second day of talks just days after the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for the Russian leader's arrest. I'll talk to a former war crimes official ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now.
From everything I've seen from this New York district attorney is that this would be something he'd be doing for political points. And I think what we know is when you get into political prosecutions like this, it's more about revenge than it is about justice.
Welcome back. That was Nikki Haley becoming the latest Republican presidential hopeful to attack Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg ahead of potential charges against former President Trump. If you're scoring at home, every potential Trump rival who has spoken out, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Vivek Ramaswamy, and now Nikki Haley, have attacked the probe into the former president as a political endeavor. Joining me now to discuss this is a fantastic panel. Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters, Simone Sanders Townsend, host of Simone on MSNBC, and former senior advisor to Vice President Harris, and Brendan Buck, former advisor to Speakers Boehner and Ryan. He is also an NBC News political analyst. Thanks to all of you. We have a robust discussion today. Jeff, let's start off with the fact that we have been here before.
Yeah.
Covering a moment when it doesn't seem like Trump can survive politically. This time a little different because there's legal jeopardy. But is this moment different for the former president?
I will not be the first person to go out on a limb and say it's different, because every time it seemed different, it didn't end up to be different. And I think the conventional wisdom that this might help him politically is not something that you can sneeze at. It might. It might also really hurt him in terms of the fact that it's a legal proceeding and being indicted and having a mugshot potentially and all of those things. It's not a good look for a former president. I also think that you mentioned the other Republican candidates talking about it. At least one of them, Governor DeSantis, made a point of saying, I think, porn star and affair. You know, like, so there was also a little bit. He worked that in. So I think you know they were probably all on brand in terms of we have to criticize the DA, but I think they'll probably try to use it to their advantage as well.
Brendan, what do you make of how Republicans have been responding so far? I mean, Ron DeSantis actually went the furthest in a way. Jeff is right in terms of also taking a jab at Mr. Trump over this.
Yeah, and credit to him. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to do. Talk about the merits of why we're even having this conversation. He cheated on his wife, who I believe was pregnant at the time, with a porn star, and then paid her off. That seems like something we should talk about. But most of the other Republicans don't want to do that. But I think it speaks to the currency of the Republican Party today is, who are your enemies? And this is sort of the quicksand that you get in with Donald Trump, because All Nikki Haley is doing there is reminding people that there are people on the left that don't like Donald Trump. That's all you need in today's Republican Party. That's what Ron DeSantis has written on, that there are people in the media, people on the left that don't like him. So she's saying people on the left don't like Donald Trump. All it does is help him. She's trying to insulate herself, I understand. But if you're trying to beat Donald Trump, you might want to remind people why he's in this mess in the first place.
Simone, what do you make of that, and what do you make of the strategy that we've seen from Republicans so far?
I mean, look, I think I agree with Brendan that it seems as though Republicans who have at least announced that they are running for president, and then some Republicans that maybe would like to run for president but have yet to come to a decision, have all coalesced around this idea that it is not a popular position to attack Donald Trump. That can hold up now. A debate stage is a number of months away, but at the end of August, it will be the first Republican debate. And if everyone is standing on that stage singing Kumbaya and not differentiating themselves, what are you telling voters in a primary? You have to sell yourself about why they should vote for you and not the other person.
Not to mention a general. I mean, the extent to which this may say to independent voters, you know, do we really want to go through this again? The kind of drama that seems to come with the former president.
Absolutely. And if you're running for the Republican nomination, you have to have the general electorate in mind as well, because if you get that far and you're able to differentiate yourself from Donald Trump, that's a real plus in the general election, because we know that independent voters are not as excited about President Trump, former President Trump, as his base is.
I will say it is asking a lot of Republican voters to worry about electability. And I think we've seen in a lot of polls recently, they care a lot more about who excites them. And if you're hoping that people will say, well, maybe he can't get elected, I think that's a very important thing to think about. I just don't know that a lot of Republican voters are thinking that way.
I don't think they thought about that in the midterm elections. I mean, if you look at the midterm primaries, who Republican voters sent forward to face Democrats in general elections in these Senate races and some of these governor's races, these were not the most electable folks by any means, but I do think that the candidates and their staff have to be thinking about the point that Jeff made. Like, are you going to stand on that stage and be cozy with Donald Trump come August? Are you going to stand on that stage and be willing to take a hit and keep on moving because you are thinking about your ability for the following election?
Well, and not to mention a number of those candidates were chosen by former President Trump. And as we discussed earlier, in the closing days of the midterms, it became all about Trump and Mar-a-Lago. I want to play a soundbite from candidate Trump in 2016 talking about Hillary Clinton. I want to get everyone's reaction on the other side.
If she were to win this election, it would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis. In that situation, we could very well have a sitting president under felony indictment and ultimately a criminal trial. Her current scandals and controversies will continue throughout her presidency, and we will make it, honestly, look, it's going to be virtually impossible for her to govern. Now, the Republicans have talked very tough, and the Democrats. It's going to be just another mess for another 4 years, folks. A mess.
Simone, let me have you respond to that. I mean, is President Biden watching this and thinking, maybe I should take a page out of that playbook if, in fact, I'm facing off against former President Trump? Do you think he should be commenting on this?
I don't think it benefits President Biden at this point to say anything about what is happening with former President Trump, particularly because the talking points from Republican members of Congress and Republicans across the board is that this is a politically charged investigation. So if the President of the United States of America, who is also going to be running, allegedly assuming for re-election, probably against Donald Trump, maybe, doesn't seem good for him to weigh in. I had to laugh because what a lot of progressives often talk about, that, oh, Republicans are projecting, what they're saying is what they're doing. And I laugh because I usually do not agree with that. But in this case, what Donald Trump said, it seemed like he was talking about himself.
Oh, that's interesting. I want to shift gears a little bit. And as we talk about how these Republican candidates are or are not differentiating themselves from former President Trump, Jeff, Nikki Haley very notably wrote an op-ed today, and I want to read a little part of it. She writes, Mr. Biden's hemming and hawing is consistent with history on national security. More surprising is the weakness from some on the right. This is about Ukraine. They say the U.S. shouldn't care about Ukraine because this war isn't our fight. Some call it a mere territorial dispute. They say we should ignore Ukraine so we can focus on China. This has it backward. China loses if Ukraine wins. That was Nikki Haley in the Wall Street Journal today, really laying down a marker on Ukraine against DeSantis and Trump.
Yes, and I was going to say, like, maybe didn't say DeSantis specifically, but that's in particular who she's shooting that arrow at. And after what he said about Biden and Ukraine and Russia in general, that is going to be a flashpoint in this next election. There's no question, both in the primary and in the general.
Brendan, we've been talking about, like, to what extent do these candidates need to start carving out their own lanes? I mean, as Simone is saying, look, the debates are not until the end of summer, and yet, is it important for these candidates to start saying, look, this is how I would be different than former President Trump, and yes, I'm not afraid to take off the gloves?
Look, early when you run, I think your job is to introduce yourself, define yourself, and so I give people a little bit of slack on that. But if you're ready to go, if you're ready to take shots at people, first of all, I think you should call them out by name. Who are the people you're trying to differentiate yourself with? And Nikki Haley clearly has one job first, and that is to make herself the alternative to Donald Trump. So I understand why she's going after Ron DeSantis. But she may not have a whole lot of time. Let me throw out the idea. She may not make a debate stage. There may not be debates. I don't know that Donald Trump is going to want to debate any of these people, and he may insist that it's only Ron DeSantis. I don't think we can assume normal rules apply. So point being, if she wants to differentiate herself, if she wants to elevate herself, if she wants to take out her opponent, she needs to start doing it right now.
Simone, what do you make of that? And do you think we're going to see more of what Brendan is saying, that candidates have to start differentiating themselves now?
I think the candidates are scared, frankly. I think that they are looking at, they are out there talking to voters, talking to Republicans. And when you talk to voters and Republicans, folks say, I don't necessarily like Donald Trump's antics, but I liked his policies. I liked what he did. They will name things that they appreciated from the Trump administration. And you look at, there's a story in The Atlantic today about focus groups that Sarah Longwell's group has been doing with real Republicans. And they had very terrible things to say about Mike Pence. They did not feel as though he did his duty as a vice president. They didn't feel like he has differentiated himself. And a number of them knocked him for what they felt was being not supportive of former President Trump. And so I think folks are looking at that, and the backbones are not strong, Kirsten. I think you need a strong backbone if you want to run in the primary.
Well, and it's going to be very interesting to see if and when former Vice President Pence gets into this. He says he is still talking to his family and praying about it. So we will wait and see. Thank you. Great discussion. We could keep this discussion going. Jeff, Simone, and Brendan, really appreciate it. Coming up next, America's adversaries closer than ever. President Putin and Xi sign a new economic agreement as the two leaders seek to strengthen ties. What it means for the U.S. and the war in Ukraine next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. America's two biggest adversaries signed a joint statement today agreeing to deepen economic ties and boost cooperation. Chinese President Xi described the 2 days of talks with Russia as frank and fruitful, while Putin said the Russia-China relationship is at its highest point in history. Putin added the two leaders spent a lot of time and attention discussing China's so-called peace proposal for the war in Ukraine, which U.S. officials have dismissed in its current form as a distraction from Russian atrocities. As the war grinds on, officials tell NBC News the Pentagon is planning to accelerate its delivery of U.S. tanks to Ukraine, which comes amid continued concerns about Beijing's deepening military involvement in the war. Joining me now is NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube and Bonnie Glaser, managing director of the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. Courtney, I want to talk with you first. I know you have been reporting right up until this minute. So talk about this push to accelerate delivery of tanks to Ukraine. Is this going to make a difference?
It will not be there. They will not be there in time for this offensive, the spring offensive and Ukrainian counteroffensive that we've been hearing so much about for weeks now. We don't expect them there. But the fact that the Pentagon and particularly the U.S. Army has really been pushing hard to figure out ways to get these tanks to the Ukrainians and get them fielded as fast as possible, this is really an indication that is working. So what they're going to do here, Kristen, is take some older model M1 Abrams tanks and take the hulls from those and refurbish them and rebuild them and then send them over. According to the officials who we spoke with, our colleague Carol Lee and I, they should be there by this fall. So that's a dramatic step up in timeline from where we were hearing when they first made the announcement that they were going to send these 31 tanks to Ukraine. At that time, officials were telling us it could be years before they'd actually be fielded. Now, in fact, they will be there in a matter of months, Kristen.
Courtney, it's just extraordinary. Very quickly, how did they make the determination, and how did they make this happen faster than was expected?
So there's two ways. These M1 tanks are different than the ones that we had been. There was a lot of concern about the logistics and maintenance needs of an Abrams tank. They're an extremely complicated vehicle. These M1 tanks, for one thing, can run on diesel fuel, not jet fuel. That was one of the big concerns. It's a lot cheaper. It's easier to get. And also, the U.S. is going to refurbish and provide some maintenance support vehicles. So that will take care of some of that logistics concern. But in addition to that, they're going to put some new USAI, that's the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, funding towards this to pay for all of this. So it just took some time for them to figure out how they could do this. But again, while this is an extremely accelerated timeline from what we initially heard 2 months ago, they will not be there in time for this offensive. The Leopard tanks that are being provided by some allies should be there in time, though, Kristen.
Incredible reporting. Courtney Cubie with Carol Lee. Really appreciate your bringing that to us. Bonnie, I want to turn to you and get your reaction to the Putin-Xi meeting, which obviously is looming over all of this and the war in Ukraine that Courtney was just reporting on. What is your takeaway from this agreement that was just signed? What's the significance?
Well, the agreement really focuses on economic cooperation between the two countries, which, of course, has been strengthening in recent years. There will be, of course, more trade that goes on, and military technology, I think, as well. I think we can be confident that not everything has been reported that is going to take place between Russia and China. But what's really noteworthy is that Vladimir Putin really hyped the importance of agreeing on the completion of this new Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. And Xi Jinping did not seem to be quite as enthusiastic and said that he would study this pipeline. Now, this pipeline really is to enable Russia to sell the oil and gas that it's been selling to Europe to China instead. And so if Xi Jinping does not want to become overly dependent on Russia going forward, then he might not be so keen to do this now, or he might really seek to get some concessions for it going forward. But it doesn't seem to be as high a priority for Xi Jinping as it is for Vladimir Putin.
No, that is a notable difference, and one obviously the White House is paying close attention to. I want to ask you broadly, because obviously the Biden administration is concerned that this meeting is only strengthening ties between China and Russia, and that ultimately that could strengthen Russia's hands in the war in Ukraine. The U.S. has notably been scaling back its rhetoric ahead of this meeting. Is that the right move? What more do you think the U.S. should be doing in this moment?
Well, I think that the United States certainly should be encouraging, as it has been, to have Xi Jinping call Zelensky. There has not been a phone call between Ukraine's leader and China's leader since the beginning of this phase of the war in February of last year. And Xi Jinping should take into account Ukrainians' interests. And in its 12-point position paper, which really shouldn't be referred to as a peace plan, it's a summary of China's positions, China says very clearly that this conflict should be addressed and ended according to the UN Charter. And that means condemning Russia's invasion, and it means supporting the sovereignty of Ukraine.
And of course, China has yet to condemn Russia's invasion. One of the things the White House is really concerned about is the possibility that there could be a ceasefire agreed upon. And the concern there is that that would essentially ratify the land that Putin has seized and has tried to ratify as Russia's land. How concerned should they be about that? Has the threat passed now that the meetings are over?
Well, I don't think that Xi Jinping is really that keen to be a mediator in this conflict. Clearly, Vladimir Putin is not interested in ending this war, and neither right now is Zelensky. And I don't see the possibility of Xi Jinping putting pressure on Putin to end the war, just because the Chinese somewhat opportunistically facilitated this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That really should not lead people to think that China is stepping up as a mediator for the conflict in Ukraine.
Bonnie,
I think what's really clear is Xi Jinping wants to be seen as a peacemaker. He doesn't really want to be one.
That's so well put. Very quickly, how concerned should the administration still be that China is considering providing lethal aid to Russia? Is that still a key concern?
Well, it's definitely a concern that the Biden administration has. I don't think that the Chinese want to provide massive amounts of lethal aid, but they will find ways to support Russian economy. They've already been providing semiconductors, and they will continue to creep up to that line of provision of lethal aid. I had a Chinese diplomat ask me, what is lethal aid? What constitutes an aid? A fork, I was told, could be lethal aid if in the wrong hands. So this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, but the Chinese are going to continue to provide assistance to Russia without triggering sanctions on Chinese companies. It is really important for European countries to express their concerns, both privately and publicly, I would say, to the Chinese, that China would have a very high cost to pay if it were to cross that line.
Bonnie Glaser, thank you so much for your analysis on such a critical week. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And despite Chinese President Xi's visit to Moscow, much of the global community continues to try to isolate Putin. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin's alleged war crimes. For more on this, I'm joined now by Stephen Rapp, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So we have to just start with the big picture here, which is that Russia's not a member of the ICC. And a lot of people are wondering, what is the real significance here of this arrest warrant? How do you see it?
Well, it really is legally irrelevant whether they're a member of the UN or an ICC specifically here or not. Ukraine has given jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide to the ICC. That's territorial. It's, in other words, if one of us goes and commits a crime in Toronto, it's up to the Canadians to decide where we're going to be prosecuted. If someone commits a crime in Ukraine, it's up to the Ukrainians. And they've said the serious crimes go to the ICC, and that's really their business. The way to avoid that is don't commit crimes in Ukraine, and by this indictment and by all the other information and evidence we have, massive crimes are being committed by Russian forces under the command and control of Vladimir Putin. And we've got these allegations, and very strong ones, regarding the forcible deportation of children. So the ICC does have jurisdiction. Now, the question is, will they get Putin? What's the significance of it? And, we've seen other situations in the past with Milosevic at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, Sierra Leone Special Court. We prosecuted, my predecessors and myself pursued Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, indicted him while he was a sitting head of state. That Liberia hadn't recognized our court, but because it had been an internationalized court with the United Nations, we were able to get cooperation and bring him into custody and try him and convict him and sentence him to 50 years, which he's serving today for war crimes and crimes against humanity. In those situations, we had strong support of third states and of major countries like the United States and the European Union to bring pressure on countries to cooperate. And the crucial question here is whether there'll be that level of cooperation. But the Yugoslavia one is an interesting one because there it was Yugoslavia got sanctions lifted. It got off certain lists by cooperating on Milosevic. Later on, other major suspects like Mladic and Karadzic came in because of other economic and political incentives. Yeah. And frankly, I think the message to Russia will be, as long as this guy's your leader, you're not going to get back in the world system. You're going to suffer in terms of your growth and the economic health of your country. And eventually he may be pushed aside and a convenient place for him to go, maybe The Hague.
So I guess that leads me to the question. I mean, do you think there will be that type of pressure to ultimately hold him accountable? And do you expect that other officials will face charges, other Russian officials?
Well, there's no question the ICC will charge, I think, other individuals. And we hear that there are additional charges pending potentially in terms of the attacks on civilian infrastructure, particularly the attacks that Russia's launched since October, particularly after the Ukrainians had succeeded in their offensive in Kharkiv and elsewhere. In order to punish the people, as winter was coming on, they announced this offensive against utilities, basically basically trying to freeze and starve people over the course of winter, and hardly any effect on the military front in terms of what was happening in Kherson or in Bakhmut. That's a war crime, and so. Those could be against Russian generals. They could be as well against Putin. So we'll see those charges again. There's the possibility of a court being created to deal with the crime of aggression as well, that many countries support, and that Ukraine really wants to see. That President Zelensky yesterday messaged leaders in London that this is what he really wants to see, because it's the whole crime. It's the death raining from the sky last February of peaceful people not doing anything to provoke Russia, and suddenly their whole country's turned upside down. Their young men are in battle, and their houses are being destroyed, and women are raped, and people are detained, and horrible things are happening. And why? Because they were going to be a successful democracy, and that was a threat to Putin. So there's that crime too.
Former Ambassador at Large Stephen Rapp, thank you so very much for your perspective. We will continue to watch this. Appreciate it. After the break, we're on the ground in Los Angeles, where a massive strike has shut down the city's schools as thousands of bus drivers, counselors, custodians, and support staff demand better pay. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Tens of thousands of Los Angeles Unified School District union workers are on strike today, shutting down the nation's second largest school district. The work stoppage is set to keep 500,000 students out of the classroom for 3 days if an agreement is not reached. The strike was brought over failed wage increase negotiations for education support staff, including teachers' aides, special education assistants, bus drivers, and custodians. Those workers are joined on picket lines in stormy weather by tens of thousands of members of LA's teachers' unions. LA's school superintendent told NBC News it was just not possible to keep schools open without the workers and teachers. NBC's Maura Barrett is on the ground in Los Angeles as the strike got underway. Maura, you are there with folks who are on strike right now. Tell us what the latest is and what folks there are saying to you.
The energy here, Kristen, is obvious as you see the thousands of union workers and the teachers who are supporting them saying they're not going to cross the picket line to go into class today, joining them outside the LA district headquarters right now. There is palpable frustration and anger directly towards the superintendent, who publicly is online saying that he's ready to return to the negotiation table after about a year-long effort with the union members here, as they're asking for a 30% wage increase. But they say that there's a disconnect when it comes to the negotiation table with the superintendent. He's saying the same thing. I want you to hear with one of the teachers that I spoke to here that said he came out in order to support some of his colleagues who are living on the poverty line, going to work every day. He said he's very upset with the way the superintendent is acting. Take a listen to what he told me.
Austin Buettner, the last superintendent when we had a strike, was, very much on our side, surprisingly, and was much more, I think, sympathetic to the worker. This gentleman, Mr. Carvalho from Miami, has taken a different tact with everyone. It's been more kind of tyrannical. I hate to use that word, but he's a very strong personality and obviously a very intelligent man, but he seems to really want to play hardball.
That teacher told me he's not confident about these negotiations, but he is hopeful. Again, the union is asking for a 30% wage increase. The district has come back with a 23% wage increase, as well as health benefits. But as long as those negotiations are stalled, they plan to continue this walkout, this strike, for the next 3 days, Kristen.
Maura Barrett, great reporting. Of course, so many families impacted with students relying on meals there, and they are trying to get those meals to some students, but of course they can't reach everyone. Maura Barrett, thank you so much. Still to come, why the CEO of TikTok says the company is at a, quote, pivotal moment as he prepares to testify before some House lawmakers who want to ban the app nationwide. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The TikTok CEO took to his own platform to appeal to American users for support today ahead of planned testimony on Capitol Hill later this week as Washington considers a countrywide ban of the popular video app. Take a look.
Hey, I'm super excited to announce that more than 150 million Americans are on TikTok. That's almost half of the US coming to TikTok to connect, to create, to share, to learn, or just to have some fun. This includes 5 million businesses that use TikTok to reach their customers, and the majority of these are small and medium businesses. Now, this comes at a pivotal moment for us. Some politicians have started talking about banning TikTok. Now, this could take TikTok away from all 150 million of you. I'll be testifying before Congress later this week to share all that we're doing to protect Americans using the app.
There have been bipartisan calls for a ban on the app. Lawmakers have sounded the alarm on data security concerns about the Chinese-owned company. I'm joined now by Keith Krach, chair of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. He served as former Undersecretary of State during the Trump administration. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Let me just have you, if I could, respond to that news that we heard there from the CEO of TikTok. 150 million users, nearly half of the U.S. population. What do you make of that? Is it too big to ban at this point?
By the way, there's more reason to ban that. So if you think about it, Kristen, that both sides of the aisle agree that our number one national security threat is Communist China. And you know, I can tell you as Undersecretary, when I was behind closed doors with Congress many times, you couldn't tell the difference between a Democrat and a Republican. This is a bipartisan issue. And no matter how you look at it, TikTok is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, legally, structurally, from a data governance standpoint, from a leadership perspective. And TikTok is programmed to be weaponized. You know, if China can weaponize a balloon, think of what they can do with 150 million TikTok users in America at their mercy.
So I want to ask you actually about your time at the Trump administration, because you were among those leading the efforts to try to ban TikTok back in 2020. Didn't work. You were blocked legally. Now you have the Biden administration effectively calling on the parent company of TikTok to divest, or else they say they are going to move to try to block the company. If it didn't work then, can it work now?
It absolutely can. You know, our initial mission was 5G with Huawei. That's when we created the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies. We defeated their master plan to control 5G. We were able to get 60 countries and 200 telcos joining us on that. And we also announced clean apps and clean stores. So TikTok was part of that. Tencent was part of that. Clean cloud with Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent. So it absolutely can be done, and I'm really glad to see this being picked back up.
But legally, how does it stand up? If, and this is a big if, we're not there yet. I'm told this could be months before there's any resolution. But how would it stand up legally, do you think, at this point?
Well, that's the law in Congress, the PROTECT Act, that gives the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, to be able to ban any technology from our adversaries that's a threat to national security. It's really that simple.
Let me ask you about something that was in the Wall Street Journal today, reporting that TikTok has what has been referred to as web tracking pixels embedded in U.S. government sites. Does that mean it goes deeper than data collection? How concerning is that to you?
By the way, it's super concerning. I mean, you think about what they can look at, what they can absorb. They're tracking your keystrokes, bank records. You know, they can track where you're at. But here's the other thing. It's not just about you as a user. It's about everybody you digitally interact with, your family, your friends, your business associates. In essence, what it is, it's a digital virus. And that TikTok virus, you know, the only cure for that, the only vaccine for that is really a total ban.
And what do you say to critics who say this is an overreaction? The only reason why lawmakers and the government are going after TikTok is because this is essentially a Chinese-owned company?
By the way, it's a national security threat. You know, there's a number of things. I'll give you one, for example. I have 11-year-old twins, and the way TikTok is programmed, it preys on children. I mean, it's disguised as candy, and it's actually a cocaine. And And I think this is coming out everywhere.
Let me ask you, what do you say to your children? What should the message be? Because we've heard from so many parents who have kids who use TikTok, and the parents have real concerns, but the kids love it.
Yeah, by the way, you tell them the truth. And even 11-year-old twins can understand the threat from communist China. They see on TV Putin's bloody invasion of the Ukraine. They see the totalitarian twins together. They understand. And I think this is a chance to have a great discussion with children on this.
Well, we will keep this discussion going. Keith Krach, thank you very much for your great information. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being with us this hour. Chuck is back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.